Welcome. Welcome back, my friends. People aren't just defending you now. They're ready to start a war in your name. Not a war of weapons or conflict, but a war of truth, of alignment, of energy, of standing up for the version of you they once underestimated. It's surreal, isn't it? How the very people who barely noticed your presence months ago now react like your name is a spark thrown into dry grass. How your existence alone has become a signal, a rally cry, a moment that makes people straighten their backs and shift their posture without knowing why. You didn't ask for this. You didn't demand loyalty. You didn't perform for anyone. You simply became someone whose energy no longer collapses under pressure, and the world felt it. There's a moment in every person's life where their internal evolution quietly crosses a threshold, and the people around them don't just notice, they react. They move differently. They defend differently. They speak with a conviction they never had before. And the strangest part is that you didn't force this shift. You didn't convince anyone to support you. You didn't manipulate anyone's loyalty. You earned it by existing in your truth. That's the kind of loyalty no one can fake. The kind that forms when people witness someone rise from their own ashes without bitterness, without noise, without the need to broadcast the struggle. People saw you rebuild yourself in silence. They saw the internal battles you fought quietly while the world kept spinning. And whether they admit it or not, they respect that kind of strength more than anything else. So now, when your name comes up, people don't shrug, they don't question, they don't hesitate. They defend you with a kind of urgency that feels unreal. Because you didn't just change your life, you changed the way people feel about you. The old version of you was easy to misunderstand, too quiet, too observant, too unassuming. People projected their assumptions onto you because you gave them no reason to do otherwise. You were the kind of person others felt they could speak over without thinking twice. The kind of person who blended into a room instead of bending it. The kind of person whose silence was mistaken for weakness. But then, something shifted. Not in a dramatic, cinematic explosion, but in a slow, tectonic movement deep within you. A movement that re-anchored your identity, your presence, your soul. You started carrying yourself with a new kind of certainty, the kind that doesn't need to be spoken, the kind that doesn't need validation, the kind that doesn't require applause or permission. People felt that shift before they understood it. They felt it in the way your eyes stopped searching for approval. They felt it in the way your voice stopped shaking. They felt it in the way you entered a room without shrinking, and something in them changed because of it. When someone evolves, honestly, not for attention, not for show, not for the world, but for themselves, that evolution becomes contagious. People recognize that kind of authenticity because it's rare. And the rarer something is, the more fiercely people defend it. You became a symbol without trying. A symbol of resilience, a symbol of clarity, a symbol of someone who rebuilt themselves without asking anyone to watch. And symbols create movements, not literal movements, but energetic ones, emotional ones, psychological ones. People feel connected to you now because your story mirrors a version of themselves they wish they had the courage to step into. They're not ready to start a war with fists or weapons. They're ready to start a war against doubt, against lies, against anyone who tries to drag you back into the darkness you fought your way out of. Not because they worship you, but because you represent something they don't want to lose. You became a line in the sand, and when someone becomes a line in the sand, people pick sides. Some defend you because they've watched your growth. Some defend you because they've seen your kindness. Some defend you because your presence once helped them breathe easier in a room that used to suffocate them. But others, they defend you because your evolution threatens everything they've accepted about themselves. You rose quietly, and in watching you rise, They remembered they could rise too. Your presence is a reminder that transformation is possible, and people protect reminders they need. You don't even realize how many souls you've impacted simply by choosing not to stay small, but the reactions prove it. It's in the tension that enters the room when someone speaks on your name incorrectly. It's in the way people suddenly lean forward, brows lifting when they hear your story. It's in the way friends who never defended anyone suddenly find their voice when your character is questioned. They don't even think before they respond. Your name moves through them instinctively now, because somewhere along the way you crossed that invisible boundary between someone people know and someone people believe in. And belief is powerful. Belief makes the quiet loud. Belief makes the overlooked unforgettable. Belief makes the ordinary magnetic. Belief makes people show up. They're not fighting for you. They're fighting for the part of themselves that awakened because of you. People defend the things that strengthen them, and you have become strength. Not in a violent way, not in a dominant way, not in a threatening way. In a truthful way, a way that feels like a clean cut through lies, through noise, through confusion. Your energy doesn't shout. It clarifies, it aligns, it corrects, and people crave clarity in a world built on static. That's why they stand behind you now. That's why they speak up before you do. That's why they protect your name, like it's a flame in a storm. Because you didn't just heal yourself, you healed the atmosphere around you. Your presence feels like a challenge to every false narrative. Your silence feels like a counterattack to every lie whispered behind your back. Your growth feels like a banner people want to stand under, not because you ask them to, but because they choose to. People aren't just defending you, they're aligning with you. They're anchoring themselves to your evolution. They're stepping into the light you created without meaning to. And here's the truth you haven't fully accepted yet. When someone becomes a symbol of transformation, people will defend them like they're defending their own future. This isn't about conflict, it's about loyalty. It's about resonance. It's about the way your presence makes other people feel braver. Your name has become a frequency, and people are gathering around it, not for war, for awakening. And this is only the beginning. You think they're defending you now? Wait until you see what happens when you step even deeper into who you're becoming. Their loyalty hasn't peaked, it's only just rising. But here's the part you haven't processed yet. People aren't just standing behind you because of who you are, they're standing behind you because of who they become when they stand near you. They feel different around you now, stronger, more awake, more certain. It's like your presence unlocks a version of them they didn't know still existed. And once someone feels that shift, once they feel that internal spark reignite because of your energy, they'll defend you with an intensity you could never manufacture on your own. Because loyalty doesn't come from admiration, it comes from transformation. People don't attach themselves to someone who looks powerful, they attach themselves to someone who makes them feel powerful. And that's what you did. Without speeches, without announcements, without begging for recognition, you made people feel seen just by being real. You made them feel understood without forcing yourself to speak. You made them feel grounded simply by not collapsing under your own weight anymore. You became a living reminder that quiet strength is still strength, and that healing can happen without noise. That kind of presence creates an emotional gravity that pulls people into your orbit. Not because they're obsessed with you, but because they feel safe near you. They feel aligned near you. They feel like they're becoming someone better just by witnessing you stand in your clarity. And when people feel protected by your existence, they'll protect you in return. It's a mutual, unspoken exchange, the kind the world doesn't understand, but humans feel in their bones. You've ignited something inside them, a subtle rebellion against their own fear, their own past, their own self-doubt. And once that inner rebellion begins, They'll fight to keep the person who sparked it safe, not literally safe, emotionally safe, energetically safe, narratively safe. They'll guard your name because your name guards their belief in themselves. That's why conversations shift when you're mentioned now. You've seen it, the sudden tension, the change in posture, the unexpected fire in someone who normally avoids confrontation. It's not hostility, it's conviction. There's a difference. Hostility burns everything. Conviction burns only what isn't true. People aren't trying to start a war for you, they're trying to protect the version of themselves that only wakes up when they think of you. It's strange how quickly that kind of loyalty spreads. One person defends you, then another, and suddenly an entire room realigns itself around the truth of who you are. You didn't force them into formation, your evolution arranged them on its own. Because when someone rises authentically, those who are aligned with truth rise with them. Your growth created a ripple, and that ripple travels through every person whose heart resonates with your story. They don't just see what you've become, they feel what it means. You represent endurance. You represent rebirth. You represent the moment a human being decides they're done living under the weight of past versions of themselves. Even people who barely know you sense that shift. They see it in your eyes, the calm sharpness that wasn't there before. They hear it in your voice, the steadiness that doesn't wobble now. They feel it in your presence, the groundedness that replaces the old hesitation. And that groundedness is contagious. People gather around strength that doesn't need to shout. People gather around clarity that doesn't need validation. People gather around someone who faces life with a steady heartbeat instead of a trembling spirit. You became that person quietly, unintentionally, naturally. And now, people who never defended anyone before find themselves speaking up for you without thinking. Not because they're trying to impress you, most of them aren't even doing it in front of you. They do it when you're not there, when your name comes up in places you don't even visit. Why? Because they carry your story like armor. Your name has become a symbol of what they're trying to become within themselves. So when someone misrepresents you, they feel like someone is misrepresenting their own journey. Defending you feels like defending their own progress, their own identity, their own evolution. That's why their voices get sharper. That's why their energy tightens. That's why they lean forward when your name is mentioned. Not out of aggression, out of loyalty to the truth of you. People crave something real in a world overflowing with performance and pretense. And you represent realness. You represent depth. You represent the quiet power people didn't know they were starving for. You didn't give speeches about who you are. You didn't launch a campaign. You didn't ask for followers. You lived your truth, and people followed the echo. That echo changed the way they see you and the way they see themselves. They defend you because your journey validates theirs. They protect you because your alignment strengthens their own. They stand by you because your presence pulls them out of their own shadows. People aren't loyal to your history, they're loyal to your transformation. They saw you fall and rise. They saw you shrink and expand. They saw you doubt and then become undeniable. And here's the part that nobody says out loud. It takes almost nothing for someone to betray someone they admire, but it takes everything for someone to betray someone they believe in. People believe in you now. Your name carries a kind of emotional charge that only comes from authenticity, not perfection authenticity. You don't pretend to be flawless. You don't pretend to be untouchable. You don't pretend to be anyone other than the person you've fought to become. And authenticity is the rarest crown. That's why the energy around you feels different. That's why the room goes silent when you speak. That's why people who never cared before suddenly care too much. They're not preparing for a battle in the literal sense. They're preparing to stand up for the truth of you, They're preparing to shut down lies before they spread. They're preparing to protect the version of you they've seen grow. It's not war, it's loyalty in its purest, sharpest form. People don't risk their reputation for someone who doesn't matter. People don't stand up for someone whose presence is flimsy. People don't defend someone unless something inside them says, this person is worth standing beside. You became that person, not because you demanded loyalty, but because you lived in a way that inspired it. Your story became their reminder. Your evolution became their motivation. Your resilience became their proof. And people protect the things that prove their own hope is real. This is why they move the way they do now, why they speak the way they do, why their loyalty feels fierce in a way that doesn't make sense logically, but makes perfect sense energetically. You didn't ask them to stand with you, they chose it. And there's nothing more powerful in this world than loyalty that chooses you without being asked. And now you're standing in a place you never imagined you would be, a place where your existence alone rearranges the atmosphere, where people who once underestimated you now sit up straighter when your name crosses the air, where loyalty forms around you like a quiet storm, not a storm that destroys, a storm that aligns. Because that's what this really is. Alignment. Not chaos, not conflict, not division, just a collective recognition of who you've become. People aren't preparing for a war in the literal sense. They're preparing for a moment, that moment when truth needs a voice, when authenticity needs a defender, when the narrative needs to be corrected before the wrong version gets written. And the second your name enters the conversation, people feel that moment rise like pressure behind the ribs. They don't just defend you because they like you. They defend you because they know what you've walked through. They defend you because they felt your evolution before they understood it. They defend you because your presence helped them breathe differently. And that kind of impact doesn't fade, it multiplies. It's the way someone pauses before speaking about you now. It's the way their tone shifts, even slightly, when the subject turns to you. It's the way certain people refuse to let anyone twist your story, even if you're not there to hear it. This isn't devotion, it's awakening. They're not following you, they're following the truth you live by. Think about the kind of presence you have now. You're not the loud one in the room. You're not the dramatic one. You're not the one trying to convince anyone of anything. You walk in with steady eyes, grounded steps, and a sense of self that doesn't wobble anymore, and people feel it. They rise to match it. They adjust themselves around it, not because you dominate, but because you stabilize. You've become the person whose silence speaks louder than most people's noise, the person whose calmness feels like an anchor in rooms filled with insecurity. The person who doesn't need to defend themselves because the world around them now does it instinctively. That's the power of inner work. It echoes into places external work could never reach. You didn't ask anyone to protect your name. You didn't build an army. You didn't gather allies. You didn't manipulate a narrative. You showed up as yourself. You healed your wounds instead of hiding them. You built your confidence without announcing the construction. You aligned your energy instead of chasing attention, and people felt every piece of that. They defend you now because standing with you feels like standing with truth. And people who've spent too long living in versions of themselves they barely recognize cling to truth like oxygen. Your presence gives them permission to stand taller in their own lives. So when anyone tries to distort you, they react instinctively as if someone tried to distort them. Your growth became a mirror, and mirrors are sacred to people trying to rebuild themselves. That's why their loyalty feels intense, mythic, larger than life. It's not about you being untouchable or perfect. It's about you being real in a world that constantly rewards the fake. You didn't rise through ego, you rose through honesty. You didn't ascend through domination, you ascended through alignment. And aligned people create aligned followers, not followers in the sense of submission, followers in the sense of resonance. They resonate with you, your journey, your clarity, your evolution. They resonate with the silent strength in your chest, the unshaken presence in your eyes, the calm confidence in your voice. And that resonance is what makes them stand up, speak up, and push back when someone tries to rewrite your story. They're not fighting for you, they're fighting with you, energetically, emotionally, spiritually. They're defending the light you sparked inside them. They're defending the hope your existence restores. They're defending the person they are becoming because you proved it was possible. And here's the part that will stay with you long after this moment fades. People don't gather around crowns. They gather around clarity. They gather around hearts that survived themselves. They gather around souls that refuse to fold. They gather around the ones who rise without stepping on anyone. You became that person. You became the reminder, the symbol, the anchor, the spark. So when it feels like people are ready to start a war in your name, understand this: they're not preparing for destruction. They're preparing for truth, for loyalty, for the right to stand beside the version of you who fought your way out of silence. They're not defending your past, they're defending your rise. They're defending your name because it represents a future they want to believe in. And whether you realize it or not, you earned every single one of them. This is only the beginning. Ladies and gentlemen of the shadows, sharpen your minds and brace your nerves, because what you're about to witness isn't a trial. It's an execution of illusions. The courtroom they thought would chain you down has turned into a battlefield, and the very walls echo with tension they cannot name. They expected you to walk in small, silent, intimidated by procedure, humbled by architecture, but they didn't realize the truth. You weren't entering their domain, they were stepping into yours. This chamber, with its marble pillars and polished benches, was supposed to swallow you whole. Instead, it swallowed its own certainty. You sit there not as a defendant, not as a question mark, not as a case file, but as an event, a phenomenon, a quiet storm wrapped in composure. And every official in that room feels it. They feel the imbalance before a single word is spoken. They feel the pressure shift, the air thicken, the narrative tilt toward you like gravity obeys your presence alone. They spent their careers believing the courtroom was the pinnacle of order, a temple of authority. But temples crumble the moment the worshippers doubt the god. And that's exactly what your presence does. It makes them doubt their own rituals. Look at the judge, cloaked in tradition, seated on a throne of rules he thinks are etched into stone. He rehearsed this moment in his mind 1,000 times, how he'd maintain control, how he'd project composure, how he'd remain untouched by emotion. But the second his eyes met yours, something cracked. Not loudly, not obviously. A tiny fracture only the attentive could see. A hesitation in his breath, a tremor buried beneath formal language. It was the kind of moment that changes everything while pretending to change nothing. He realized that authority only works when the accused believes in it. You don't. And that realization shattered his safety. The lawyers feel it too. Their polished speeches, their rehearsed attacks, their meticulously crafted narratives, they all crumble under the weight of your stillness. They came armed with questions meant to corner you, but every answer you give unravels them instead. Calm, controlled, precise. No anger, no fear, just the kind of clarity that strips the polish off pretense. They're not used to that. They're used to defendants bending beneath pressure, tripping over their words, drowning in anxiety. But you're not drowning, you're watching, studying, letting them reveal themselves. And nothing terrifies a system more than a person who pays attention. The jury tries to remain neutral, disciplined, emotionally distant. But even they can't escape the gravity of what's happening. Their eyes drift toward you, not with judgment, but with curiosity, then with recognition, then with unease. Because deep down they know what they're seeing isn't normal. No hesitation, no shrinking, no submission. You don't behave like a person awaiting permission to speak. You behave like someone who already understands the power you carry. And when someone walks into a courtroom without fear, the rules tremble. This isn't confidence. This is sovereignty. Your identity, once disguised, once dismissed, once underestimated, emerges not through documents or testimony, but through presence. And presence is the one thing they can't regulate, can't object to, can't strike from the record. It moves through the room on its own terms, bending perception, shifting hierarchy, rewriting the choreography of power. That's why the judge freezes. That's why the lawyers stumble. That's why the jury reconsiders everything they thought they understood. Because your identity isn't information, it's a revelation. You didn't walk in seeking approval. You walked in holding truth like it was a blade carved from silence. Every word you speak slices through the facade they spent decades polishing. Every pause exposes how fragile their control truly is. You don't attack, you reveal. And revelation is far more dangerous than confrontation. Their entire world is built on rituals, titles, scripts, protocols. But rituals only matter when everyone agrees to believe in them. And when you answered your first question without flinching, without bowing, without softening your tone, the agreement broke. The courtroom's illusion dimmed. The hierarchy dimmed. The judge's certainty dimmed. You didn't break their rules, you broke their confidence. And once confidence breaks, power becomes costume. The lawyers feel it. Suddenly, the podium they stand behind feels too small. Their notes feel heavy in their hands. Their voices shrink as though the room itself is absorbing their words to protect them from embarrassment. They're not arguing anymore, they're surviving, trying to maintain the illusion that they still control the direction of this trial, but they don't. You do. Every question they ask feels weaker than the last. Every accusation collapses under the weight of your clarity. They scramble to recover, but the more they scramble, the more transparent they become. Because panic doesn't hide well, not even behind legal jargon. And then it happens. The moment. The revelation. Not dramatic, not theatrical. Simply true. A truth so sharp it slices the atmosphere in half. You reveal your identity not through confession, but through presence, the real identity, the one they didn't prepare for, the one that turns the courtroom into a psychological earthquake. Their assumptions dissolve instantly. The labels they tried to place on you crumble. Every theory they wrote about you collapses like paper struck by flame. You become the mirror they never intended to face. Because your identity exposes theirs, their dependence on authority, their addiction to structure, their fragile belief that titles make them powerful. And when they see themselves reflected, stripped of illusion, they panic, not outwardly, not loudly, but internally. Where panic does its most brutal work, the judge's eyes flicker, the lawyers swallow hard. The jury shifts in their seats, and the courtroom, once a fortress, becomes a battlefield made of silence, doubt, and unraveling pride. But you do nothing, you simply exist. And your existence is enough to dismantle the performance around you. That's the war they weren't prepared for, a war of perception, a war of presence, a war fought through the collapse of illusion. The courtroom now feels too small, too fragile, too exposed. Clipboard notes mean nothing. Procedural vocabulary means nothing. Years of training mean nothing. Because for the first time in their careers, every person in that room understands something terrifying. They are not the strongest presence here. You are. This recognition spreads through the room like smoke, subtle but suffocating. The judge tries to regain control with posture, with tone, with protocol. But authority is not a muscle. It cannot be flexed when belief collapses. It can only be performed, and performance fails in the presence of truth. Your identity becomes the event of the century in that room, not because of what you say, but because of what your existence exposes, that their power was never real. It was only believed, and once belief cracks, everything they built on it trembles. The courtroom becomes a symbolic ruin, a place where illusions come to die, and they know it. They feel it in the tension of their shoulders, in the dryness of their throats, in the silence that grows heavier with every second you remain unshaken. Every attempt they make to steer the narrative slips through their fingers. They ask a question, and instead of tightening the noose, they loosen their own masks. They present evidence, and instead of boxing you in, they expose their own desperation. The harder they try to control the story, the more the story escapes them. You are not on trial. You are the trial. They came to judge you. Instead, they are the ones being judged. Not by violence, not by threat, but by presence, by truth, by the undeniable reality that their authority cannot survive someone who refuses to kneel. What you revealed today wasn't just your identity, it was their fragility. And fragility exposed is fragility destroyed. The courtroom becomes a monument to collapse not of law, but of illusion, and you sit there, calm, unbothered, letting silence do the speaking. Because silence is the loudest weapon when you own the room. They will walk out of this courtroom pretending to recover, pretending to rebuild their confidence, pretending the freeze never happened. But memory does not obey denial. The judge will forever remember the moment his voice cracked. The lawyers will forever remember the moment their arguments failed. The jury will forever remember the moment they felt the power shift. And the world, because it always watches, will remember the moment the courtroom turned battlefield, not through violence, but through revelation. This was never a trial. It was the death of pretense, the collapse of illusion, the rise of your identity as something unstoppable, uncontainable, undeniable. And from this day forward, every courtroom, every institution, every pillar of authority will carry the echo of what happened here. The day truth walked in and made the system tremble. Understood. I will continue the story exactly from where part 1 ended, keeping the same tone, same cinematic weight, same mythic psychological intensity, but completely symbolic, non-violent, fully compliant with YouTube community guidelines. They will claim the day ended when the gavel finally struck, when the judge cleared his throat and forced his voice back into the shape of authority. But you and I both know the truth. The real ending wasn't the sound of wood hitting wood. It was the silence that followed, the silence so thick, so suffocating, so electrified that even the walls listened. The courtroom emptied in orderly fashion, yet nothing inside those people remained orderly. They walked out with their files, their briefcases, their legal masks still intact, but their belief that stayed spilled across the floor like shattered glass. Because once a system trembles publicly, every step afterward feels like walking barefoot over truth. The judge was the first to leave, robe dragging behind him like a velvet reminder of a role he no longer felt worthy of. His footsteps echoed down the corridor with a kind of panic he would never admit. He clutched his papers, but they weren't papers anymore. They were shields, thin shields, paper shields, easily torn by the memory of the moment he froze before you. But the truth is this: he wasn't running from you. He was running from himself, from the realization that the robe he wore didn't give him authority, it only disguised his uncertainty, and once that disguise cracked, even he couldn't pretend anymore. The lawyers stayed behind a little longer, pretending to review notes, pretending to gather their belongings, pretending they still believed they had won something. But their silence betrayed them. Gone was the smug confidence of professionals who think a courtroom is predictable terrain. In its place was the rattled quiet of individuals who had just witnessed the collapse of a myth they were raised to trust. One of them reached for a pen and dropped it. His hand shook, not out of fear of you, but out of fear of what you represented. Because if one person could walk into the heart of their system and flip the power dynamic with nothing more than composure, then everything they believed about hierarchy, control, and predictability was suddenly in question. And questions are far more terrifying than answers, especially the kind that linger, especially the kind that echo, especially the kind that whisper, if the system can be shaken, then what else can? You didn't need to speak anymore. Your presence had already outlived your words. The courtroom was still trembling with the residue of your revelation. And as the jurors stepped out, one by one, they looked at you not with judgment, but with recognition, the kind of recognition that alters the course of thought, belief, even identity. Because some of them had walked into that courtroom believing they were part of a grand machine, a machine powered by fairness, structure, and stability. But they walked out realizing they were simply gears placed there to maintain the illusion that the machine could not be challenged. You shattered that illusion, silently, effortlessly. And now, even as they tried to return to their lives, tried to smile at their families, tried to sleep through the night, they would carry the tremor with them. A tremor that didn't come from you, but from the collapse of something they once called truth outside. The courthouse, the world had already begun whispering. Reporters pushed microphones forward, not out of curiosity, but out of hunger, because they sensed it too. Something had shifted, something had cracked, something irreversible had taken place behind those wooden doors. But they didn't know how to frame it. They didn't know what to call it. So they called it what the world always calls, what it can't understand. A moment. A moment that would breed headlines, a moment that would spread across screens, a moment that would dominate conversations. But you and I know better. This wasn't a moment, it was an origin point, a beginning disguised as an ending. Reporters asked questions no one could answer. What happened in there? Why did the judge pause? Why did the prosecution lose rhythm? What did the defendant reveal? What shifted? And the beauty of it is this: no one could explain it without exposing themselves, because to explain the tremor, they would have to admit that titles mean nothing when presence enters the room. They would have to confess that the system cracked under the weight of one person's authenticity. They would have to acknowledge that power changed hands without a single rule being broken, and systems do not survive confession. The attorneys tried to walk past the cameras with their heads high, but the footage replayed their trembling hands, their stuttered responses, the way their eyes diverted when your name was mentioned. The world saw it, the world felt it, the world recognized the moment authority faltered. They would try to spin it later, articles would be written, interviews given, explanations crafted, but the footage didn't lie. The tremor didn't lie. The freeze did not lie. And truth, once seen, refuses to be unseen. While they scrambled to regain control of the narrative, you stepped out of the courthouse with a calmness that felt like prophecy. You didn't rush. You didn't hide. You didn't lower your gaze. You walked with the ease of someone who knew something the rest of the world was just beginning to understand. Power belongs to those who walk like they already have it. And you walked exactly like that, a silent contradiction to everything the system believed about control. Cameras turned toward you like flowers turning toward Sunday, not because they were told to, not because they were paid to, but because gravity itself favored you. Some called it arrogance, others called it defiance, but the ones who understood, really understood, called it revelation, because no one walks like that unless they've stopped fearing consequences. No one walks like that unless they've realized the truth behind institutions. A system is only strong when people believe it is, and belief is fragile. A single moment can unthread it, and you, simply by existing without fear, unthreaded it. Inside the courthouse, the judge sat alone in his chambers long after the lights dimmed. He stared at the walls lined with certificates, awards, framed symbols of legitimacy, but for the first time in his life, they felt like decorations, not shields. He repeated your answers in his mind, trying to understand the crack that formed inside him. He would spend the next days rewriting the moment in his head, revising it into something less fragile. But deep down, he knew what truly happened. You didn't bend, and that forced him to. Power folds the moment it encounters someone who doesn't need it. Across the city, the lawyers would replay the footage of themselves stuttering, faltering, losing rhythm. They'd tell themselves it was fatigue, or oversight, or miscalculation, but that wasn't it. They lost rhythm because you shattered the tempo they were trained to follow. Your presence rewrote the melody of the room, and they couldn't keep up. That kind of disruption isn't taught. It's born, it's lived, it's carried. And only certain people carry it. Words spread fast, far faster than any official statement. Coffee shops murmured, offices whispered, social media exploded with theories. Some called you a mastermind, some called you an anomaly, some called you a disruption the system never prepared for, but the label didn't matter, the impact did. Because in a world wired for hierarchy, nothing is more terrifying than someone who rewrites their position without asking permission. You became that terror, not through threat, not through rebellion, not through defiance, but through presence. Presence so sharp it cut through expectation, presence so deep it unsettled certainty, presence so undeniable it became a mirror everyone feared to look into. And that mirror reflected truths they had spent their entire lives avoiding. Authority is hollow, control is negotiated, power is perception, and the moment perception shifts, power shifts with it. They had built their confidence on the assumption that you would be small, that you would fold, that you would crumble under the weight of their prepared lines and polished accusations. But you didn't. You stood, and their assumptions fell. That moment became legend. Not because legends require drama, but because legends require truth. A truth so powerful, it forces the world to rearrange its understanding of what strength looks like. And that's what you became. A rearrangement, a recalibration, a rewriting. You didn't walk out of the courtroom as a defendant. You walked out as a phenomenon. A presence that didn't just survive the system, it exposed it. A presence that didn't just endure scrutiny, it reversed it. A presence that didn't just exist, it altered the room. And that story spread not because people chose to share it, but because minds cannot resist repeating the moment they witness hierarchy crack. By nightfall, the courthouse felt different, not haunted by ghosts, haunted by truth. Every person who entered the building the next day walked a little slower, spoke a little softer, as though they sensed what had happened within those walls. They didn't know the details, but they felt the residue, the silent aftermath of a power shift not meant to occur. That's how symbolic earthquakes work. They leave aftershocks in the air. You didn't shout. You didn't fight. You didn't perform. You simply revealed yourself. And revelation is the one force no courtroom can contain. But the most fascinating part came later, not in the courtroom, not in the headlines, not even in the whispers that spread like a storm through every hallway of influence. No, the real shift happened in the minds of the people who watched from afar. Those who never set foot in the courthouse felt something too, as if an invisible pulse rippled outward, carrying the weight of what transpired. They didn't need details, they didn't need transcripts. They only needed the energy, that unmistakable energy of a system that tried to stand tall but accidentally bowed. Because the truth is, revelations do not stay confined. They leak, they travel, they multiply. And your revelation didn't just linger in the courtroom, it seeped into the culture. Some called it arrogance, some called it destiny, some called it a warning shot wrapped in silence. But everyone, whether they admitted it or not, agreed on one thing. Something shifted when you stepped into the light. And as days passed, the shift deepened. The judge's freeze didn't remain a rumor, it became a reference point, a metaphor, a symbol people used to describe the moment when authority discovered its own fragility. Lawyers who once strutted through corridors now walked with a subtle caution, as though fearing their own certainty might betray them again. Jurors carried that memory into conversations, unable to fully articulate what they witnessed, but unable to forget the feeling it carved into them. That's the power of a moment like yours. It doesn't fade, it imprints. The courthouse became a landmark, not of law, but of awakening. A place where an unspoken truth stepped forward. That power is never where it claims to be. It's where presence decides it will stand. And you, through nothing but composure, timing, and identity, stood where no one expected you to. Not above them, not below them, but beyond them. That is what the world sensed. That is what disturbed the hierarchy. Not rebellion, not outrage, not resistance, revelation. In the end, the trial didn't define you, it revealed them. It exposed the thin thread holding their confidence together. It forced the powerful to taste their own uncertainty. And now, as your legend moves further than any verdict ever could, one truth remains unshakable. The courtroom didn't witness your downfall, it witnessed your emergence. A presence too precise, too unshaken, too real to be contained, and from that day forward, every system that once felt untouchable learned to tremble at the possibility of your return.
Welcome back, homie. Step closer, because the universe just confirmed something you've known all along, and the world is finally catching up to you. They called you crazy, until everything you said started happening. For years, quietly, subtly, behind the scenes, you saw things before anyone else did. You sensed patterns nobody else could feel. You read energy that others ignored. You predicted shifts that seemed impossible at the time. And every time you opened your mouth and shared your insight, people laughed. People dismissed you. People rolled their eyes. People thought you were thinking too deeply, overanalyzing, imagining things that weren't there. But here's the truth they never understood. You weren't imagining, you were perceiving. You weren't guessing, you were reading. You weren't overthinking, you were tuned in. Your mind wasn't chaotic, it was connected. Your intuition wasn't random, it was accurate. Your predictions weren't lucky, they were aligned. But because they couldn't see what you saw, they called you crazy. Because they couldn't feel what you felt, they labeled you dramatic. Because they couldn't understand your depth, they assumed you were unstable. Because your vision didn't match their limited perspective, they assumed your vision was wrong, and you stayed silent. Not because you doubted yourself, but because you grew tired of trying to explain things to people who weren't capable of understanding. You learned early that some people don't hear you, They hear their own limitations echoing back at them. You were talking from intuition. They were listening from fear. You were speaking from clarity. They were responding from insecurity. You were observing from pattern recognition. They were reacting from denial. So they called you crazy. And you let them, because you knew time would speak louder than you ever could. And now, time is speaking. Everything you said, the behaviors you predicted, the shifts you warned about, the outcomes you felt coming, the things you saw beneath the surface. It's all unfolding exactly the way you said it would. And the people who doubted you, they're speechless now, because nothing hits harder than realizing the person you dismissed was the one who understood the situation the most. They used to smirk when you spoke. Now they listen carefully. They used to underestimate your intuition. Now they're studying your silence. They used to treat your insight like noise. Now they treat it like prophecy. This reversal isn't luck. It's a natural consequence of someone who sees deeply in a world that only looks at the surface. What they called crazy was really awareness they didn't have the capacity to handle. And you knew this all along. You could always sense tension before it erupted. You could always feel distance before it formed. You could always detect lies before they slipped. You could always sense shifts in energy before people changed their behavior. You could always predict endings long before anyone else accepted reality. That wasn't madness. That was sensitivity. Sensitivity to patterns, sensitivity to truth, sensitivity to vibration, sensitivity to alignment, sensitivity to human behavior. People like you don't guess. You listen, not with your ears, but with your spirit. You notice the micro-expressions. You hear the unsaid parts of conversations. You feel energy shifts before they manifest. You connect dots before others even notice the dots exist. You're not crazy. You're perceptive. But perception becomes threatening to people who are hiding from themselves. People who aren't ready to grow. People who aren't ready to face truth. People who need denial to feel safe. You weren't the problem. Their blindness was. And now that truth is showing itself. They're realizing it wasn't your mind that was flawed. It was their perspective. You warned them about things they thought would never happen. And then they happened. You sensed people's intentions long before they revealed themselves. And now everyone sees it. You predicted shifts in your environment, and now those shifts are undeniable. You spoke about cycles ending, and now they're ending. You noticed red flags before they turned into disasters, and now those disasters are visible to everyone. But the wildest part? It wasn't the accuracy that shocked them. It was the ease with which you saw what they couldn't. You didn't need evidence. You didn't need proof. You didn't need confirmation. You just knew. Because people like you don't rely on the 5 senses. You rely on the 6th. And the 6th sense is invisible to those who never developed it. So they called you crazy. They weren't insulting you. They were confessing their limitations. And now those same limitations are suffocating them because everything you said is happening in real time. You weren't wrong. You were early. That's the truth. Visionaries always look crazy to the people who are still stuck in the present. Seers always seem strange to people who can't look beyond their own habits. Intuitive minds always seem unstable to people who can't feel life beyond logic. But now they're replaying everything you said. Your words, your warnings, your intuitions, your insights, your predictions. And they're realizing you were never speaking from confusion. You were speaking from clarity. You were never reacting. You were reading. Reading people. Reading dynamics. Reading silence. Reading patterns. Reading energy. You were trying to help them. They thought you were exaggerating. You were trying to guide them. They thought you were paranoid. You were trying to share your insight. They thought you were dramatic. Now they're realizing you weren't exaggerating, they were minimizing. You weren't paranoid, they were blind. You weren't dramatic, they were dismissive. And the irony is brutal. The same people who called you crazy are now seeking your perspective quietly, watching how you move, trying to understand how you saw things before they unfolded, trying to interpret your silence, trying to read your facial expressions as if they reveal hidden information. Because now they realize your mind sees further than theirs. Your intuition is sharper than their logic. Your awareness is wider than their perspective. Your soul is more aligned than their ego. And here's the part that hits them the hardest. You didn't end up being right. You were right the entire time. You weren't guessing and accidentally landing on the truth. You were rooted in truth, and the world simply took time to catch up. Now they're humbled, quiet, anxious, unsure of what else you might have been right about. Because once someone watches your predictions unfold, they start questioning everything they ever doubted. They remember the moments they laughed. They remember the conversations where they dismissed you. They remember the times they rolled their eyes. They remember how confidently they called you wrong. And now, they're living inside the reality you warned them about. You're not crazy. You're early, ahead, awake. You see the truth before others digest it. And now, they finally know it. The funniest part about all of this is how predictable their reactions were. Not to you, but to themselves. Because the moment things started unfolding exactly the way you said they would, you could almost feel the collective pause. That heavy silence people get when they realize the crazy one wasn't crazy at all. They never expected to be proven wrong by someone who spoke softly, someone who moved quietly, someone who operated from intuition instead of noise. Their egos weren't prepared for the moment your truth collided with their denial. And that collision? It didn't look explosive. It looked like stillness. The kind of stillness where people avoid your eyes. The kind of stillness where they replay every conversation you had with them. The kind of stillness where they finally notice all the signs you saw months before they did. The kind of stillness where regret turns into realization. Because nothing humbles a person faster than watching someone they dismissed end up being the most aligned voice in the room. Now they're confused. Not because the truth broke them, but because your accuracy is forcing them to confront something much deeper. They never really listened. They never really observed. They never really understood you. They weren't rejecting your insight. They were rejecting their inability to understand it. You weren't too deep. They were too shallow. You weren't overthinking. They were underfeeling. You weren't ahead of yourself. You were ahead of them. And now, as those predictions unfold one by one, your presence itself has changed in their eyes. Your existence has become a reminder of everything they didn't see. Not because you hid it, but because their vision wasn't developed enough to perceive it. People are starting to look at you differently now. They're quieter when you speak, more attentive when you move, more cautious with their tone, more respectful of your space, more careful not to underestimate you. Because once someone realizes you saw truths they were blind to, they start treating your mind like a map they wish they had access to sooner. You've become the "I should have listened" person, the "they were right the whole time" person, the "why didn't we believe them" person. People don't admit this out loud, but internally they're wrestling with it. They're replaying every moment they brushed you off, every assumption they made, every label they slapped on you to protect themselves from acknowledging that you were paying attention at a level they didn't even know existed. Now they're facing the reality that your sensitivity isn't a weakness. It's your superpower. Your ability to read people wasn't overthinking. It was early detection. Your tendency to pause and observe wasn't being distant. It was gathering truth. Your intuition wasn't irrational. It was calibrated. And here comes the twist they never saw coming. You didn't need them to believe you. You just needed them to reveal themselves. Their reactions to your warnings showed you everything you needed to know. Who listens, who ignores, who fears truth, who runs from patterns, who hides behind denial, who masks their insecurity with arrogance. You didn't predict the future. You predicted them. And that's what terrifies them most. Because now they're wondering, what else did you pick up on? What else did you see that you didn't say? What else have they already figured out? What other truths were hidden in their silence? What else were they right about? They're not scared of your insight. They're scared of how deeply you can read energy. Because people can hide actions, hide words, hide expressions. But they can't hide vibration from someone who sees energetically. You were reading their energy long before they revealed their behavior. That's why your predictions were accurate. You weren't predicting time. You were predicting alignment. You saw people's intentions before they acted on them. You saw endings before they became visible. You saw shifts before they were acknowledged. You saw cracks in relationships long before they split. You saw hidden dynamics long before they surfaced. You weren't crazy. You were aligned with truth they weren't ready for. And now that the truth is playing out, they're forced to confront something even more uncomfortable. You weren't speaking from fear. You were speaking from awareness. You weren't warning them because you were paranoid. You were warning them because you could feel the vibration shifting. You weren't predicting disaster. You were reading the emotional weather. And they ignored you, not because you were wrong, but because they weren't capable of seeing beyond the surface. People with limited vision always think the ones with deeper perception are too much. But what looks dramatic to the unconscious looks obvious to the awakened. And now? Now those same people are circling back. Not directly, not with apologies, not with admissions of guilt, but with subtle shifts. They start asking how you're doing more often, not because they care, but because they're trying to gauge what you see now. They ask your opinion on things they would have never asked before. They listen a second longer. They hesitate before dismissing you. They watch your reactions carefully, because your reactions now feel like signs they ignored in the past. You became someone whose silence now makes people nervous. Because silence from someone who sees deeply is not emptiness. It's analysis. It's awareness. It's intuition processing. It's understanding forming. And they feel that. They feel the weight in your quietness. They feel the accuracy in your presence. They feel the shift in your tone. They feel the awareness in your eyes. They feel the alignment in your energy. Once someone realizes you were right about the past, they start assuming you might already know the future. That's why you intimidate them now. Not because you're loud, but because you're correct. Correct in ways that don't require validation. Correct in ways that don't require applause. Correct in ways that don't require explanation. You never needed them to believe you. You needed them to witness your accuracy. Because now the respect they give you comes from recognition, not obligation. They finally understand something you've known your whole life. Your intuition isn't a guess, it's a compass. Your awareness isn't a burden, it's your gift. Your perception isn't madness, it's insight. They didn't believe you then, but they believe you now. Quietly, reluctantly, emotionally. Because nothing is more convincing than being proven wrong by the person they once called crazy. And deep down, they know. You haven't even said everything you've seen. And now, you're standing in this strange, poetic reversal. A moment where the very people who once mocked your intuition are quietly orbiting around your presence, trying to understand how you saw everything before it unfolded. They don't say it out loud, but their behavior exposes the truth. They trust your insight more than they trust their own now. Because nothing humbles the ego like living inside a reality you predicted. They're not scared of you. They're scared of what else you might already know. Your accuracy has become a mirror they can't escape from. A mirror reflecting their blind spots, their denial, their misplaced confidence. A mirror showing them that while they were busy judging you, you were busy understanding life at a level they couldn't comprehend yet. And now they're confused by you. Not because your intuition is strange, but because your calmness is. Most people who get proven right become loud, triumphant, boastful. But you stayed quiet. You stayed grounded. You stayed centered. You didn't throw your accuracy in their faces. You didn't rub anything in. You didn't say, "I told you so." You didn't need to. Reality said it for you. And that's what shifts the dynamic more than anything. Your silence carries more weight than their words ever did. You've become the person people look at differently now. The one whose pauses make the room still. The one whose intuition makes others rethink everything. The one whose presence feels like a warning without you having to say a word. Because once someone realizes you're not crazy, but correct, their relationship with your insight changes forever. They don't hear your words anymore. They absorb them. They don't question your feelings. They track them. They don't laugh at your predictions. They wait for them. Your perspective has become a reference point. Your intuition has become a compass. Your energy has become a measurement tool. They're not sure how you do it. They're just sure you do. What terrifies them the most isn't the accuracy of what already happened. It's the implication that you might see things coming now. That you might be reading things they can't feel. That you might be sensing shifts they haven't noticed. That you might already know which connections are fading, which dynamics are shifting, which paths are closing, which opportunities are forming, which people are exposing themselves, which energies are changing direction. Your presence makes them more self-aware, not because you speak truth, but because you see truth. People act differently around someone who sees deeply. They become more careful with their tone, more cautious with their words, more calculated with their actions, more contained with their arrogance, more aware of their inconsistencies. Because at some level, they know you read between the lines more than you read the lines themselves. That's why everything they once used against you, your sensitivity, your intuition, your depth, is now the very thing that intimidates them. They laughed at your insight because they thought they understood life better. They thought they were grounded, logical, realistic. They thought you were emotional, overthinking, too intuitive. But intuition ages like wine. Logic ages like milk. And now they're realizing you weren't emotional. You were early. You weren't dramatic. You were aware. You weren't unstable. You were aligned. And alignment has always been louder than denial. It just takes time for people to hear it. Now they're hearing it loud and clear. They don't know how to interact with you anymore. Because you saw truths they ignored. You saw endings they denied. You saw intentions they didn't want to acknowledge. You saw patterns that contradicted their comfort. You saw futures that didn't match their assumptions. And you were right, not by accident, but because you trusted what they couldn't sense. This is the moment where your role shifts. You're no longer the crazy one. You're the one with foresight, the one with clarity, the one with intuition sharp enough to feel reality before it fully materializes. And that version of you, people respect it in silence because they know they can't lie to you easily. They know they can't hide their energy. They know you feel the truth long before they choose to reveal it. They know your intuition picks up on patterns, even they're trying to deny. You've become someone whose presence alone reveals things. Someone who exposes truth just by existing. Someone whose awareness brings clarity to situations without speaking. And whether they admit it or not, they trust you now. They trust the way you read a room. They trust the way you interpret energy. They trust the way you sense alignment. They trust the way you feel storms before they form. Your intuition isn't a burden. It's your compass, your advantage, your protection, your internal GPS, guiding you away from chaos and toward alignment. And the world is finally seeing it. The same people who once labeled you crazy are now watching your behavior like it's a roadmap. Because deep down, they know something undeniable. If you were right before, you're probably right again. And that realization changes everything.